was curious when I read this the other day to get to the end to see if you recommended it or not.
This was a Mike Johnson special, but yeah, I don't have a problem with it from staff. Because it still would go through the full, like subdivision review process. It just would provide an exception to 2 of those standards, but it doesn't, it's not like preliminary plat approval. It would still go through the whole review process, which I think is important, so.
What the question always comes to mind in one like this is, if the standards are good standards, they seem to be meant to apply exactly to this thing and say, we don't want you to do that.
Yeah, I've never been able to figure out this private road one.
I haven't either.
What the
I'm
good
not
reason
sure
for
if
the
it's a good
standard is.
or not. I
Yeah.
can't.
Are we
That's the first question. Is the
can't get
standard
there,
any
yeah.
good?
Are we recording?
No, I don't think so.
Okay,
It's on mute,
it's
too.
just transcribing everything we say.
Recording pause.
We're getting some good transcription.
Okay.
Just testing it out.
Yeah, I've never understood the private lane thing with lot size. I think it feels kind of arbitrary to me, like if the zoning, I feel like the zoning should dictate the lot size, not if it's on a private road or not. But there probably was a reason that it was originally written.
Well, I have learned over some time that reason sometimes is so
Yeah.
far back and obscure that there's not any good reason today.
The
Right.
only thing I can figure out with the setback one is in a very specific circumstance where you have a row of houses. And then the private right of way is supposed to be 50 feet wide if it was built today, but sometimes they put the property lines out to the middle.
Right.
So you'd have your private right of way like, like that. And I think the intent was we didn't want the 25-foot setback to be from the middle of the road because the house would be right on the back of the road.
Right away.
So instead it was, hey, we're assuming you're gonna plat your right of way as part of the lots. So half of that width is gonna be 25 feet. That's the functional curve and you go 25 feet behind that and put your house.
Oh,
That's not the case here, though. This is like a weird.
so this one is an odd shape
This is
anyway.
like a
At the
weird-
end of the road.
That's
It
the
also-
only thing I can guess of why. That
So
50-foot
they're 25 feet from the right of way though.
They are, yeah. But the right of way is not 50 feet wide. So to the middle of the road, it's only 39 feet instead of 50.
Oh,
So that's
it's all.
my guess. I have no evidence to.
That
support
makes
this, but
good sense
that's
though.
my guess.
Oh, it's fine. We just figured, like, it's not recording yet.
No, it's not. That's kind of fun to
We've just
hear
So Chair, whenever you're ready.
Okay, we recorded?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'd like to welcome you.
Wait.
One sec. Oh,
Unmuted. Yeah, is everybody else? I am not on audio.
no audio. We're good. Ian.
Wait.
He's watching now.
Okay,
Okay. I think we're good. Sorry, Garrett.
go ahead,
Good?
yes. Yeah.
Okay. We'd like to welcome everyone to the May 3rd, 2023 Planning Commission meeting, the work session. For our agenda today, we have one particular item, I believe, and we're going to review that here as well. In addition to, I'm not seeing that on the work session agenda.
That's just part of the review business session agenda.
Okay, great. So you'll introduce that to us.
Yeah.
And then we're really excited to kind of get the first kind of out into the public space talking about form-based code and just some presentation. So I don't think there will be any decisions made, but
Correct.
No.
this is kind of our first opportunity to be exposed to it. So with that in mind, we'll turn it over to staff.
Yeah, we are actually recommending we flip them and do the form-based code introduction first, if that's
Great.
okay.
Okay.
We'll be taking the other item with us to the business meeting.
Are we okay with that? Do you guys feel like are there deep dives that you're anticipating with our business item?
Yes.
Form-based code is about 20
We'll be fine.
minutes
I think
long or
we'll
so we should have
Okay,
time.
okay.
We'll be,
Are you sure? Because I'm happy to.
I know how my questions usually go, so.
That question, we're happy to
Okay.
answer them.
So with that, with everybody okay with that, we'll go ahead and switch things and
Yeah,
do
that's
form-based
great.
code first.
Okay, let's invite our consultant to come up, and if you, I don't know, sit wherever you want, Mark, you're welcome to grab a seat here or over there, or
It's fine.
whatever's easiest.
Comfortable up here.
Perfect.
So as he gets set up, I'll just give a brief
Mike,
introduction.
will you flip on
The
your,
city got a grant a couple of years ago to do a general plan update. Part of that grant included a form-based code development. It's an ordinance that Mark will talk about of how it works. But basically, the intent is this form-based code will help implement some of the recommendations of the general plan. So it's it's an added bonus on the general plan process to actually start implementing some of the things in these targeted areas of the city. So that's the context. It's being done with the general plan. It will be a city ordinance by the time this is all done though.
Can you give us context in the midst of this, just for our group, like other places locally as well as nationally where this is being used and how it's being received? So.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Sam, you want me to share my?
yeah, do you have permissions to share?
I don't think so.
I think we need to promote Mark to panelist.
Sorry.
No, you're totally fine. If there's any problems, I also have your slides pulled up and I can do them, but it's easier, I feel like, if you're the one talking to know what pace you want to go. Than the dreaded, like, next slide, please.
Okay, let's see.
It looks like you're into the panelist regime.
Worked, that's great. Okay, there we go. Thanks, Mike and Sam, and I appreciate your time today to talk about form-based code. City code is something that gets complicated and in the weeds pretty quickly. And so what we'd like to do today is really just the first kind of conversation around what form-based code is, why cities are interested in form-based code, who else are using form-based code, and how that could potentially work for Cottonwood Heights. As Mike mentioned, this is kind of an additional piece of the general plan update that's been going on here in the city. The intent of the form-based code is to really implement some of those kind of visions for changes in the city, and I'd say getting a better result from the development that you're seeing. Every city along the Wasatch Front is seeing growth pressures. I'm sure that you have seen lots and lots of things coming along and some better proposals than others. The intent of the form-based code is to give the city more tools to implement that vision. The form-based code is really it's not advancing for some reason.
Try, which key are you using?
Just forward.
Try down,
Down should work.
also no.
Space. Well, it's advancing on my screen.
Oh, so it's not moving on what you're sharing?
Let's have this.
That's peculiar.
There
we go.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay. So form-based code is a lot like learning a new language. It's really just another way to regulate land use. As you know, it has been legally settled that cities have authority to regulate land use within the city. Form-based code is really just using a different method to do that. For the most part, the form-based code is really focused on physical form of a development. It's far less regulatory when it comes to use. So right now, most cities, their zoning code, a lot of it is very focused on the use control. Form-based code, as the name implies, is really focused on the physical design of the development. And so we talk about things like the setback of buildings, the heights of buildings, the articulation of the architecture. We're far less concerned about what's going on inside. We're more concerned about how does it contribute to the public realm of the city. Form-based code, as with changing code in any city, you'll see changes incrementally. So it's not to say that all of these areas we're changing how these are regulated. It's going to be a massive change all at once. It's really looking at, with the city like Cottonwood Heights, you're going to see redevelopment come along incrementally over time. We've talked about the city's purchase of Hillside Plaza and how that could really be kind of a prototype, a catalytic project for the form-based code. With learning a new language, it's always a little bit scary at the outset. As cities get more comfortable with form-based code, it's a code type that can be expanded and grown over time to apply to more parts of the city. Form-based code is not kind of a one-size-fits-all. It's very much about the context of the area in question. And so where the city has visions of, town center development or changes along Fort Union Boulevard, the gravel pit, each of those have a very different context and very different goals. And so those areas, the code would be developed kind of with a lot of specificity for that particular area. Any questions so far? So far, so good. Okay. So in this graphic on the left, you see conventional zoning where we've got C1, C2, we've got R10, like all of those are very much it's a conventional zoning approach that really a majority of cities across the country have done for the last 80 years with mixed results. We see a lot of development that comes along and it's not really accomplishing what the city envisions, and there's not a lot you can do about it. With form-based code, as I mentioned, there's lots of discussion around how that particular development introduces improved public space, improved architectural elements. All of those things are included in a form-based code. And as I mentioned, less consideration of use. That's not to say there is no consideration of use. It's more, where are those uses appropriate in a development, and giving a lot more flexibility to property owners as far as what is the market telling us is in demand for as far as use goes. At the core of it, as Mike mentioned, what we're really trying to do is codify community goals. It's one thing to update a general plan and kind of hope for the best, but to go in and actually update the code is really where the city has a lot of opportunity to get what you envision for redevelopment in the city. The development that we get really is just a product of the code that we have on the books. So whether or not we like that development, it's really just an expression of what the code is requiring. So the big question is, how do we implement more of these goals and vision that you've gotten from this general plan update process? There are always public aspects and private aspects. And when I say public aspects, we're talking about roadway improvements, public spaces, those sorts of things that are required. Private aspects are things that are happening, on that private property, but requiring it in a way that you're getting a better outcome in the end. You don't have to understand all of this right now, but what we've done here is kind of articulating what is form and what is style. So when we talk about
form of development. We're talking about, as I mentioned, setbacks, heights, roof style, really the form of the development, not necessarily the architectural style. So the example we always use is Park City has very strict architectural requirements. And so when you build in Park City, it's going to use a specific stone. You're going to use a very specific color palette. It's a very restrictive code. That's not what a form-based code is to say, here is the style that the building has to be. That's not at all what the form-based code focuses on. It'll say things, timeless, durable materials, encouraging brick and stone and things like that. But it's not to say we've decided that Cottonwood Heights architectural style is this and that's the end. It's really saying you have a lot of flexibility as far as that goes, but where the building is located on the site, where the parking is located on the site, the heights of the buildings, those sorts of things are spelled out pretty clearly. These that you see on the right, this is an example that kind of shows how one parcel can develop in several different ways, still meet those requirements of the form-based code, but have very different architectural features, can also have different uses. So the building on the upper right is kind of a stacked flat type of apartment or condo building. The building on the lower left is more of an office development. And then on the right, those townhomes, all of those would meet the requirements of the form-based code. But again, it gives property owners some flexibility as far as what it is that they can build under the code. And if you have any questions or comments as we go.
Remind me, is there a density per acre in form-based code, or is it more so just what can you fit within the mass and the structure in the form-based code?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's not, the density per acre isn't part of the conversation. It's really more the height of the building and the configuration of that building.
Perfect.
So when we say something like, okay, buildings in this particular area, they can be no larger than, 10,000 square feet. That's really driving a lot of it. Well, you're not going to get a Walmart there because the building size is, smaller than what they're looking for. But the kind of density per acre it's just a different approach to that.
Perfect.
And maybe to answer your question about other cities that are using it, there are quite a few in Utah that have used form-based codes for quite a while now. Salt Lake City was probably the first to adopt a form-based code. That was probably 15 years ago, I would say. And they started with one particular part of the city, and they've added other areas with new form-based code.
Where in the city?
They started, I believe they started the 400 South corridor where the train goes up to the university. I think that was the first part of the city that used form-based code. I know they've added Sugar House, a good portion of it is using a form-based code. South Salt Lake now also uses a form-based code along the streetcar corridor. That one has probably been maybe 3 or 4 years. I've been involved in Farmington for quite a long time. Farmington adopted a form-based code in about 2008 near their runner station. And that one is very different because it's greenfield development, like it's really just open land. And so their form-based code was a very different approach. A couple of years ago, we helped Midvale City develop a form-based code around the historic Main Street in Midvale. So those of you who may not know where historic Main Street of Midvale is, basically they were very interested in form-based code because they didn't want to destroy historic buildings, but they wanted their development to be very context sensitive to that place, which now it's probably been maybe 2 years since that was adopted. So they may be seeing their first development under that code now.
I believe Mill Creek's corridor on the west side of State Street is using form-based, if I remember correctly.
That I don't know. I know we helped Mill Creek City with a city center plan about 4 years ago, and right at the tail end of that, they adopted a form-based code just for their new city center area, which is Highland Drive and about 33rd South, but they may have one now on the west side of it. So again, it's something that it's not an all or nothing where you have to upend everything in the city. I'd say most form-based codes are really focused on opportunities for redevelopment, commercial areas, that sort of thing. Usually it doesn't touch any single family neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are very stable, and there just isn't a lot of change expected in those areas. So The question of non-conformity always comes up. We won't get into the weeds with non-conformity, but as with, any change in zoning, there's some grandfathering in of existing things. What we've been working with staff on over the last couple months is working through what are the triggers that if someone is expanding the size of the building or changing significantly that building, at what point would they need to come into conformity with the form-based code? The process itself, again, this process of kind of understanding goals and really calibrating the form-based code to the city is very context sensitive. For this particular process, we really targeted just 3 nodes along Fort Union Boulevard, where we're already seeing some opportunities for redevelopment. There are things happening, but also kind of helping the city kind of get settled with a different way of approaching that. And then hopefully that can expand into other parts of the city. When we've met with the city council, they've had some questions about, there are kind of smaller development opportunities on Bengal, or there's big development opportunities with the gravel pit. Those, as I mentioned, can be added further down the road when there's some kind of sense of comfort with the form-based code.
What are those 3 nodes?
That's a great question. We are going to get to that in just a second.
Okay.
The process itself, this may be of interest to the Planning Commission, especially. The process is intended to be far more administrative in approval with the process, that when a property owner or developer comes along, that the staff is really the one who is helping work through those questions. And only if there's something that's a big kind of appeal to that code or some variation from that, then it would come to the Planning Commission. And so the intent is we're making a lot of design decisions up front. And only when there's a special question that comes along, which there is frequently, that's when it comes to the Planning Commission. The process itself, again, the intent is that if we stay on the blue side here on the left, that if you're meeting all of those requirements, you're sort of incentivizing to a property owner or developer. It's an easier process to go through. If they meet all of those, it's an administrative over the counter approval. With a form-based code, often the city will set up an architectural review committee, which you already have one. The architectural review committee is kind of the first review of any of those exceptions. And so I sit on an architectural review committee for Farmington. It's an ad hoc committee that really we meet maybe twice a year, where once in a while there's someone who comes along who says, I need a special exception. That kind of third-party committee reviews that and says, yes, that works, or no, that doesn't work. If the property owner wants to appeal, that's when it would come to the Planning Commission or to the City Council if they've got a special request that it wouldn't meet the code, but they have in their mind a good reason for it. So that process, again, the intent is that you're not seeing lots and lots of these come to the Planning Commission. You have to really understand the nitty-gritty of the code. Really, you're only getting the things that are the special exceptions. With the structure of the form-based code, the establishment of kind of a place type is the first part. I mentioned having lots of context as part of that code. The place types that you see here across the top, form-based code can apply to a lot of different types of development. And so metropolitan center would be something like downtown Salt Lake City, downtown Ogden. That's a very large urban center. Each one of these have a very different context. And so when we talk about, Salt Lake City has a different place type for Fourth South, they have a different place type for the Sugar House area. Each of those is established early on in the process so that we're very clear on what type of place. When you come to the point where you're adopting a form-based code for, let's say, the gravel pit area, you would come to this part and say, okay, this is a different place type than what Fort Union is. If you say, well, we're going to apply this to some commercial redevelopment opportunities on Bengal, that's a very different neighborhood scale place type. So each one of those areas is going to have a different established type that's gonna drive a lot of those choices.
How do overlays work? Like if there's a historic overlay or something within a certain zone or a node or whatnot, what takes precedence? Is it the form or is it the overlay?
Sure, that's a good question. What we've been working with staff on is trying to figure out the current overlays that you have.
Hmm.
How do we implement the kind of intent of that overlay and really replace that?
Okay.
And so usually with the form-based code, the hope is that at the end, it's a clearer process, it's a simpler process. So rather than having lots and lots of
Right.
kind of things on top of each other. So we've been talking about that with staff for quite a while to figure out how do we make the form-based code get at what the overlays in the city are intended for. So with this particular process, the boulevard community is one that we've really centered in on and said, okay, if all of these nodes are on the Fort Union corridor, the boulevard community is probably the best type, and really establishing one place type for the nodes that we have in question. The intent of a boulevard community, you know, this really defined by it's a major corridor that connects a large part of the community. And it may be not just a neighborhood draw, but also a regional draw where you have lots of people coming into Fort Union from all over the valley. You've got employment places, you've got housing, you've got shopping. You have a lot going on, but it's really defined by that boulevard. With that, we've implemented or tried to implement as well a lot of the vision and requirements from the Fort Union master plan that was adopted in 2018.
I wasn't here yet when it was done. I think it was
few-
16.
Maybe 16 or 17. Okay, so a few years ago, that plan, making sure that if we're talking about this corridor, how do we make sure that the code and that plan work well together? The types of places that we're talking about, obviously, each of these areas have a different scale of development. So when we talk about the Union Park area, we talk about the new town center area, Highland and Fort Union, those each have a very different context. And so those requirements might be a little bit different. But where we start with is kind of looking at imagery to say, okay, here's what kind of a boulevard type of development could look like. So to answer your question about where are the places we're actually looking, the first we call Union Park Center, which is really where you've already got a lot of mixed use development. You have a lot of retail, but also you have a lot of opportunity for redevelopment over the next couple of decades. The next layer of kind of definition, once we get past place type, is what we call a form district. Different colors are assigning a different type of form district to different parts of this particular node. The form district is kind of the closest parallel you would have to what someone would think of as a zone. And so the form district drives a lot of the requirements around the form-based code. So the blue, the Union Park Center form district, that is much higher buildings, the types of things that you're already seeing there, encouraging maybe a mix of use there so that it's not just defined by it's only kind of office buildings in a job center, but it's more of a mix of uses in that place.
Are there still use tables within the nodes?
There are.
Okay.
There are use tables, they're much simpler. And so the use tables for the most part are either permitted, not permitted, or upper story only. And so when we say, okay, well, that's permitted, but it can only be on the upper floor of that building, what we're trying to do is introduce some of that. How do we make the place more walkable? We have more public facing amenities and uses on those floors. The other three form districts, the Fort Union Boulevard is that orange that you see. It's not just on Fort Union Boulevard. There's a little bit that's on Highland and 13th East, but the intent is it's smaller scale development, it's commercial redevelopment, but it's not quite at the scale of what would happen in the Union Park Center. And then the residential transition, a good thing about form-based code is that you have areas where you can provide a little bit of buffering from residential areas. So it's always good to have that portion defined very specifically, what are the things that the city can do as redevelopment happens to buffer from that commercial development from single family neighborhoods that define a good portion of the city. And again, just kind of imagery of the scale of development in the for the most part, Union Park Center development would be similar heights to what's already existing, but again, opening up the door to mixed use developments that aren't just office types of development. The second note is the, excuse me, the intersection of Highlands and Fort Union. Where for a lot of people coming into the city, this is kind of the gateway into the city, their kind of first impression of Cottonwood Heights. How do we define as these places redevelop or change to have a, kind of a different image of the city as you enter from the freeway. And again, the scale here would be a bit lower than what's going on at that Union Park Center. We're talking 3- and 4-story types of development in that node. The last node, thank
Just
you.
in case you
Thank you.
get thirsty from talking.
The last node is the furthest east, the town center area. As defined during that general plan process, that this would be kind of considered the center of town for the city at 23rd East and Fort Union. So in this particular node, we've introduced a form district that's specific to town center. And that's to say, okay, the things that we want out of something that would be considered town center for the city would have different requirements than these other form districts. What those are very much to be determined, but the intent again is to create a very walkable, pedestrian, rich type of experience where, again, the city has some opportunity with Hillside Plaza to kind of be out in front of that. But as that intersection, the kind of privately owned parcels at that intersection redevelop, that there would be some direction to say, okay, in order to support this vision, here's the requirements as far as that development goes. The last I'll talk through that residential transition zone where we have parcels that might redevelop that would kind of act as that transition to single family neighborhoods around it. Having things that are for the most part defined by residential in type, maybe a little bit higher intensity than the single family neighborhoods near it, but giving a little bit of space between those types of development. Things that you're already seeing in the city, row houses, townhomes, that type of development. One of the things that I mentioned is kind of comparing existing zoning with that kind of future form-based zoning. So for the most part, where we started with was looking at areas of the city that are already zoned mixed use. And so the intent would be to replace that mixed use zone in these particular areas with that form-based code. So what we've gone through is kind of looking at what the mixed use zoning requires, what the gateway district overlay requires, and trying to, we're not changing it drastically from what those requirements are, but perhaps giving a little bit more definition in some of the areas that aren't. You see a lot of these things aren't really addressed in those existing zone requirements. And that, I believe, is the end. We've got plenty of topics we can discuss. We will be back to talk about more in the future. Don't expect you to understand all of this tonight, but any questions that I can answer as far as introduction goes.
I'm just curious, when this is implemented, the current zoning is just replaced by this in one fell swoop?
That is a really good question. Most cities have kind of a transition period where they can say, okay, you can continue to build if you would like under the mixed use zoning that you've already been under for a long time. Or you can use the form-based zoning and sometimes there's an incentive there to do that, where you can kind of give some incentive for using that new one. But having a transition period is always a good idea to have people comfortable with change.
One thing we've just kind of talked about and thinking about how we might handle that logistically is that for properties in this area that we're looking at, this area where it would apply, that are already zoned mixed use, we would expect to proactively change the zoning to the form-based code. But for properties who are in this boundary that aren't zoned mixed use today, they almost exclusively on the general plan show mixed use as that future land use, so that if someone was to rezone it, they would need to do that to mixed use. So our plan would be to just change that in the general plan to now show as form-based code. So if somebody was to rezone, they would need to do the form-based code. And then we've also talked about maybe with some of the larger parcels, like in the Union Park Center, just having proactive conversations with the property owner to say, what are your thoughts on this? You know, would you want us to just proactively change the zone? Is that something you're interested in, or would you rather continue with what you've got and kind of wait until redevelopment occurs? But it's a really good question of just like the practicality of how it would work.
And I'm just curious also where it's been implemented, what are the comments about that or the feedback that you've gotten?
Sure, I just had a conversation just last week with the planning director in Clearfield. They've had a form-based code probably about 4 years on they call Main Street. Their Main Street is mostly strip malls that need to be redeveloped. I think the place where it would probably be best to kind of focus attention is on process. He said that for some reason, the planning commission in Clearfield requires every single development application, which is a lot. And so he said the feedback that they've gotten is they would like to see that process streamlined. That it adds a lot of time and money for development to happen. They're seeing an extraordinary amount of growth in construction. If you haven't been to Clearfield recently, you probably won't recognize it. They've seen quite a bit. But I think that streamlining that process, I would say, is probably the thing that the city can do to kind of help people understand why, give them a reason to do it, that it's an easier process for them to go through. I think to Sam's point, that if, rezoning a property is not a simple or quick process. And so I think if the city says, hey, we are already providing this rezone opportunity, that can expedite things as well. And so it's kind of like, okay, if the city, you're getting things that you want from development, but also that streamlining the process or giving them some flexibility, kind of giving both sides something that benefits them.
Isn't that the trade-off though? I mean, form-based codes benefits developers, streamlines, there's predictability in terms of timelines, et cetera. But in terms of constituency, do they view the level of services going down just in terms of transparency or engagement or whatever else?
I think the intent with the form-based code is, you'll see when we get to kind of draft review, is there's far more graphic representation and tables that kind of make some clarity. And so right now, if you spend any time in the zoning code, that like,
oh, they know.
you start reading it and it's like, okay, whoever wrote this 50 years ago, like what do they mean by?
It can be really vague.
It can be really vague. And so the intent is to have far more clarity, far more predictability. And so everyone knows in advance a little bit better what's going to be required.
That's one quick comment. I get that.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is more like, I don't recall a single mixed use project coming before this body in which there weren't significant concerns by constituents. And so like, as far as I understand this basically moves that piece of the public engagement to basically a staff function.
So maybe a concern over the public meeting component, not.
Yeah,
not
I
being
mean,
part of it.
it's just like let's say, redevelopment.
Sure.
It's like certainly constituents want to voice their opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a
On
good.
traffic, et cetera.
A good point. My response to that would be, that would still be a component, or what we're proposing would still be a component for like the more special exceptions if it can
Right.
comply. But it speaks to the importance of designing this code to function really well and to achieve the goals that you as the land use authority want. So that basically your review of the feedback you give to projects is encapsulated into the code itself. So that if it's code compliant, it complies with the planning commission's vision.
I guess my concern, or not my concern, or my comment or feedback would be, it would probably be helpful from a transparency standpoint for any of the nodes to start looking at kind of impact analysis to say, if you move to a form-based code versus the current zoning, what are the entitlements that someone could get in terms of density and traffic, et cetera?
Sure, and there may be an opportunity too, to do like a development activity report that's published
Right.
publicly, so that even if stuff's being reviewed administratively and it doesn't require a public meeting, anyone who's interested can still get information about it.
Yeah. Once it moves into form-based code though, for any of these nodes, I mean, if they comply and they meet the standards and it doesn't trigger a special exception or
Right.
whatever else, there's no real public.
That would be my proposal, to kind of make that publicly available so
Right.
people could find out about it, but you're right, it would be a change from maybe how it's done in some ways.
Okay.
Now. You have a comment, Commissioner Shelton?
Same comment, so thank you.
Yeah, I think the idea with it is you develop the vision, the form, if you will, upfront. So you don't know exactly what you're getting, but you know more. Conceptually, you know more about what you're getting than you do today under conventional zoning, because under mixed use, I could build a mainly residential product, or I could build a 7-Eleven, or I could build a bank, and they could all comply with zoning. And you don't know what you're getting or how tall it is or where it's going. And with form-based code, you do know generally, hey, whatever building goes in is going to be X feet away from the property line. It's going to be subject to these things. It's going to be this tall. The building itself, the use inside it might be different. And then if they want to do something like add a drive-through, maybe that's something that comes to planning commission, because that does have a more outward impact on surrounding areas.
Yeah, I think the concept is to fine tune the form-based code to a degree where there's a level of comfort with what it would be producing. To where there's not so much variability in what the outcome would be unless there's more of those special criteria. But like Marcus said, it's kind of relearning a language, so it's important to talk through how these things would work.
It becomes so tricky, especially in Utah context, so because even though you have an ARC involved in some of the design reviews and whatever else, a lot of the Utah interpretation of what you can tell a developer yes or no, it's just not the same as in other jurisdictions. And so like, yeah, sure, a developer can build a really cool building that complies, or they can just build crap. And I think that becomes a really tricky thing when it moves away from public engagement.
I was just gonna say the distinction between the existing code and form-based code. Existing code was all created with that same set of ideas in mind, right? I mean, it was intended to be written in a way that only permitted the things you wanted to have done.
Sure.
So there's not much difference in its intent. There's some difference in its timing. We thought of this more recently, and so, but the existing code was built on the same idea that you would just permit things that would fit. And you'd have exceptions to the things that would fit in the same way. And so I don't think it's that much different from that point of view. But I do think the public will think it's very different because the public wants their chance to say, I don't like this idea. Yeah. And that's where they think they give the feedback, which creates the specificity in the way you write the code one way or the other.
But we've attached conditions on projects specifically based upon the public feedback.
Yeah.
Which becomes like, it's always that thing of trying to make a project better. Because developers will take those conditions versus taking a no and going through an appeals process.
Yeah.
Typically.
I think there will be a way to do it that will make it administratively smooth, allows for that mechanism for the public feedback. And, we're a young city. At 18 years, we still have not learned all the lessons there are to learn. But this seems fantastic and, a great first step, but
Yeah, I appreciate
figuring out what
that
those
point.
back and forth points are.
Yeah, I think
What
we'll
can
finesse
handle
it.
administratively and what things, I mean, if we can speed things up, obviously, that's great, but it does appear that these areas that we're talking about are the areas that are the highest discussed areas by
Sure.
all the residents. And so anything that sounds like it might decrease the level of public engagement, we just have to figure out what the right mechanisms are, and it needs to be before the cement is dry.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there's such an introductory conversation tonight. We'll figure out the right metric for how we do it. But my hope is that it functions in a way that benefits everybody involved and also would free up more purview for the commission to focus on larger projects. And I know Mark will guide us through the right way to kind of design that.
Did you not go further east to the top, where you have another likely node because it's not mixed use, is that the reason? I mean,
I think we started here. Canyon Center is mixed use, but it's brand new. So it's probably not gonna redevelop.
Right, you have a lot of
The ground bit
redevelopment.
is-
right around there, potential, I should say. not-
Yes, however, the recent actions by the council have said, now we kind of want to keep this residential up here. So we're focusing on the kind of town center west area where we do have probably more imminent development and more, I'd say,
More appetite.
appetite for seeing that
Yeah,
happen.
more receptivity, and like we mentioned, I think. It's buildable to where if we learn the vernacular and become a little more fluent in how it works, there's always the opportunity to apply it elsewhere, but. I think keeping it in a reasonable scope to start with would help us manage it a little bit better and then grow from there if it's a desire of the city.
Okay, I'm gonna ask us to put a pin in that and thank you so much for your input because
Thank
we
you.
have 19
thank
minutes left and I'm
Great.
excited that we have members of the public here and
If there's any other questions on form-based code, you're always welcome to send it to staff.
Great.
And we can- yeah.
This will come back multiple times.
Perfect.
This is form-based code overview of kind of what it is, and we'll get into the real nuts and bolts of it as we keep going.
thank you.
Thanks for the
Thank
presentation.
Yeah,
you.
appreciate the time. Thanks, Mark. All right, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, I'll just move right into the next item.
Jump in.
For the members of the public that are here, this is the work session. There's no public comment allowed here. That will take place at 6. Okay, just making, sometimes people are confused, so.
We just want to get to know you all.
All right. So this, I'll try to go through this quickly because I know there are questions. We can also have discussion in the business meeting. This is an exception request from Title 14 for a property at 3457 Magic View Drive. This will look familiar from your staff report, but there's a 1.27 acre property off of Magic View Drive that is requesting 2 exceptions from Title 14, and those 2 exceptions relate to private street front setback requirements and how that's measured and how much it needs to be, and then private street lot sizes. Staff is recommending approval, and this is all specified in a lot more detail in your staff report, but we'll work through why staff's recommendation is that. This is the current zoning. It's easier to see on the TV. It's just a white blob on the projector, but the entire area is zoned R18, single family residential. It's our common single family zone. Typically, when you develop an R18, you can only build single family homes, and every lot has to be 8,000 square feet. In addition to meeting standards for lot width and building setbacks and things like that. I will note the purple hash mark is a sensitive lands overlay zone. If I go back here, you can see the kind of north and west portion of the property are a fairly steep hillside. So that is the sensitive nature on this property. Here's the background on where this application comes from in the ordinance. There is a provision in Title 14 related to exceptions, and it basically says broadly, in cases where unusual topographic, aesthetic, or other exceptional conditions exist, variations or exceptions may be approved by the city council after receiving recommendations from the city's planning commission and staff, provided that the variation or exceptions are not detrimental to the public safety or welfare. That's the parameters with which we're reviewing this tonight. Do these unusual conditions exist reasonably? And does providing the exception create a detriment to public safety or welfare? And the commission's role in this is to make a recommendation. The city council has the final decision authority. The 2 exceptions requested are out of the same exact code provision in Title 14. It's spelled out here, but basically it says any building lot that is located outside a planned unit development, which fronts on a private roadway with at least 25 feet of paved surface, shall have a minimum lot area of 1/2 acre. And then additionally, the minimum distance from the center of such roadway to the front building line, that's essentially the front setback, shall be 50 feet. So this measures lot size and setbacks and frontage quite differently than the R18 zoning typically does. And it's only triggered when a development is occurring outside of an established planned unit development on a private street. I will also note, this is very important, that approval of any exceptions does not grant any building entitlement. It does not approve a subdivision of property. The entire code process with anything that's approved as an exception is still subject to apply to this. So if they need to do a subdivision, if they need to do sensitive lands analysis, building permits, engineering, all of that stuff is still required. Granting an exception doesn't grant a waiver for any of that, nor does granting an exception confirm that they for sure can subdivide the property if they have other code issues. The applicant's rationale for requesting these exceptions, and I'll get into what their proposal is in just a minute. There are unusual topographic conditions that exist. A lot of the property is a steep hillside. The subdivision of lots will require renaming of the private roadway for addressing. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second, but this is better for public safety. And this is the applicant's rationale. The shape and layout of the lot make it difficult to comply with the Title 14 standards, even though adequate acreage exists. And then other homes in the area do not comply with one of the things they're requesting an exception from, which is the 50-foot setback requirement. So here's staff's analysis, and I've got some graphics that I'll go through here. The lot is irregularly shaped. It's located at the end of a legal non-conforming private driveway. This whole subdivision situation would not meet today's ordinances. It would be done a lot differently today. This was done back around 1975. It was done legally, all permitted. So we've inherited this. It's a legal non-conforming situation. There are 6 total lots that use the same private driveway. The driveway shares the same exact name as the parallel public street to the north or to the south. And then no addresses remain in numerical order for the proposed new lot, which factors into having to rename the road. What they're proposing to apply for, if these exceptions are granted, is a 2-lot subdivision. The first lot will, they are proposing to rebuild the existing home that's there, roughly in the same location, again, subject to full city review. And then use this kind of north or southeast portion of the site to subdivide out a second lot on the property for a single family residential structure. Here's a little bit more about the addressing situation. Magic View Drive and Magic View Drive to the south here. All of the addresses are derived from Magic View Drive to the south. They generally fit in numerical sequence as you go west to east. Anytime a subdivision is done, the city takes a look at addressing any new lots that are created. And the addresses have to fit a sequence. And this is really big for public safety and emergency dispatch and things like that. For this, when we were looking at this originally, before the private road issues were identified, there is no numerical address to assign to this lot that fits in the city and the county's required addressing system. What that would require is renaming Magic View Drive, this private driveway version of it, into something that's unique. So these lots, they could theoretically have the same number as Magic View Drive, but they'd have their own road name.
And it would still be a private.
Still private, doesn't
street.
change
It'd be a
the
private
street at all.
street, yeah.
It does change the addresses, but it is better for emergency vehicles and dispatch and things like that, to not have 2 roads with the same name, especially where there's not visibility to these back lots.
Does Cottonwood Heights maintain that currently?
No, this is all private back here.
Okay.
The city maintains this road, this Magic View Drive to the south. And this driveway just was given that same address. There are a few instances of this in the city. There's some on Fort Union and Creek Road as well. But they're never good. They're always a little tricky to deal with, and it's not something the city likes to see.
And with this proposal, where is fire turnaround for that drive currently?
They would need to plat that in.
Okay.
So there would need to be, that would be part of the review of the subdivision. There would need to be an approved turnaround at the end of this, or the homes would need to be fire sprinkled.
Okay. And what was the setback request for that?
That's next here. So here are the 2 exceptions requested. I'll go over the rebuild of the proposed or of the existing home. They are requesting a 25-foot setback from the private roadway instead of the 50-foot that is in the Title 14 requirement right now. The private roadway here and the lot lines are fairly unique. I'll try to go back here. You can see the road doesn't keep going past this lot. It's not a conventional private roadway situation. It's fairly unique in that the road just ends into this lot. Measuring setbacks at all is a little tricky. And then trying to interpret how to measure 50 feet from the middle of the private road to a lot that the private road ends in is a little
So
difficult.
would the measurement be from that cul-de-sac piece?
Typically, yeah,
Wouldn't it
yeah.
be, right? So
So-
it would be from,
So what we've done is, given their proposed lot lines, it's kind of got a double front setback along the north and the west side. That's functionally the front of the home. And then, you know, an R18 front setback is 25 feet, so we would require that along there. The code provision of the 50 feet from the middle of the private road, it makes this a little complicated and it's a little confusing in how to even implement that. So cleaning that up with an exception seemed reasonable. With lot 2 to the southeast, they're requesting a couple different exceptions. One is to the lot size. We have the provision that says lots along a private road need to be a half an acre. I don't have any good evidence for why that code provision exists. We did look into it. I don't know why that exists, why lots on private roads are, you know, regardless of the underlying zoning, are supposed to be half an acre. But this does result in 2 lots that are both compliant with R18 minimum lot size standards. Lot 1 as well is, you know, roughly an acre still. Lot 2 is still over 8,000 square feet. And then the setback requirement, that 50 feet from the middle of the private road. The middle of the private road is actually this 39-foot measurement. The 25-foot measurement here is the edge of the private road. So the exception here is going down from 50 to 39 functionally. The property lines, again, are irregular because of the shape of the lot and how they would need to subdivide this. But again, they are meeting, with this proposal at least, they are meeting the minimum R18 setback.
so the second lot, when I looked at it, it backs against the public Magic View Drive. correct?
Not quite. There is
Oh,
a
it
home.
doesn't?
Yeah, there's a home.
I meant it backs against a home that's on
Yeah, uh-huh.
that road.
Correct.
Okay, so the thought about that it's on a hillside and all that does not apply to lot 2. It only really applies to lot 1.
The hillside really is lot 1.
Yeah.
And it is steep. Yep.
Yeah.
So the northern boundary of the proposed structure, where is that relative to what the current existing structure is?
It comes along like, well, I'll try to just flip back and forth. You can see, you know, it kind of comes along, you know, this kind of line here.
For building 1, sorry.
Oh,
Like
the northern boundary.
The boundary of the proposed structure.
Yeah. So you can see here,
Yeah,
again, staff has not reviewed this. This is subject.
got it. I
This
understand.
house is not approved, but I'm guessing the dotted line here is the existing, you know, retaining wall structure overlooking the edge.
Okay,
According to this document, it looks like they're proposing to expand that. That's going to run into some challenges with city code. So that's the next chapter of this. Now he could go rebuild this lot today. The exception really helps him get the second lot. But this will go through full sensitive lands, hillside analysis before anything's approved here.
Spin forward again. Where you have in the proposed structure number 2 in the second lot, that 25-foot setback. That's to the road there, isn't it?
That's that property line is this gray line under the word magic.
Yeah.
That's
So-
basically the edge of the road today.
Can you go back to the other picture? It said to the center of the road.
Well, the center of the road is this upper
Okay,
lot line. Like it'd be like right here.
okay.
So it jogs, the property line jogs. a
So
little
he's
bit.
basically 39 feet from the center of the road and 25. feet
25 from the edge.
Okay.
I like lot 2.
Yeah.
And
Lot
that's,
2 just seems very small. When I drove, it's a very small lot. And
It's 8,000 square feet.
yeah,
You know, that's what it needs to be.
R18, but that's not what it is if it's a private, right?
Yeah, Title 14 says if it's on a private road, it has to be half an acre, which seems a little challenging if you meet the underlying zoning to then have this unclear rationale for why then I have to triple my lot size if the road's private. So staff findings, the subject property is located in a legal non-conforming subdivision. The development layout, the irregular shape of the property There's enough reasonable evidence here to conclude that this is an unusual topographic, aesthetic, or exceptional condition. Neither requested exception results in a violation of standard R18 zoning requirements. We would have concerns with that if it did, because that ventures into variance territory, which is not what we want to do here. Any future subdivision application is still subject to full review and compliance with other aspects of city code. Again, that's important to reiterate here. The slope stability analysis and the engineering and all of that is yet to be done.
We don't define the unusual topographic. Other municipalities.
It's not defined by ordinance.
But we don't, right?
No, there's no definition other than, it's just that line.
Right.
Pretty broad. The private driveway addressing will be improved by subdivision requiring new addresses and a roadway name. This enhances public safety. And that has been confirmed with our mapping staff, but also police and fire, and said, yeah, this is a less than ideal situation as it is today. And then other nearby homes on the private driveway, they do all appear to be half an acre, but they do not comply with that 50-foot private driveway setback standard today.
How much of a setback do they have?
Well, it's kind of hard to tell.
It's hard to tell.
Some of these are close, some of them might be 50.
But if it's 25 feet, is that gonna look out of place in that neighborhood?
I don't think so. And you can see when we go
It's
back
really
to
tucked,
maybe
it's tucked back in there. I mean, if anything, it's just the proximity of the houses to the road, the width of the road, and the fact that the terminus of the road. I mean, that's, I think.
Yeah, it's a
The only people
driveway.
going down
Out of
there.
place.
Yeah,
the
only people
one
going
directly
down
to
there are
the
people that-
east, the house right next to it.
Which are gonna have
Is
to be
about the
even more
closest.
impactful on that end of the road than.
Yeah.
So
Mike, what would be the requirements if they just left this as is, built an ADU? How close could they be setback wise?
you,
And how big of a home could they build, or an ADU could they build in that site? Could it be about the same size as that proposed structure?
well, so they've gone through this exercise. You cannot build an accessory building in the front yard. So
And they're qualifying this as the front.
yeah, staff has looked at this too. I don't know how you call this anything but the front of this
Yeah.
property. So there's a lot of open flat space. You cannot build an accessory building in it by code.
That would be precedent setting.
Yeah.
So this did start as a variance application for that exact thing. It didn't, in staff's opinion, meet the variance criteria, so they segued into this exception request. So we can continue talking about this, but for those reasons, staff is recommending approval. We've got model motions in here, and again, this does go on to city council.
Great.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Terrific.
Yeah,
Okay.
you get to do it in
I know.
person.
With that,
Wait. I can't totally.
yeah, no, that's okay. For the public, we're just enjoying being present here together. I noticed that Commissioner Chapel is joined us, and Commissioner Chapel, any questions that you have?
So it doesn't count anymore.
No questions. We're great. Thank you.
Terrific, glad to have you. Okay, so with that, I'll entertain a
Motion to adjourn.
motion to adjourn. Second, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, we are adjourned. And we will reconvene at 6
Muscle memory.
as soon as we can get in there and get seated for